We begin with developing news from Northwestern, where Athletic Director Derek Gregg is being reassigned to the new role of Vice President for Athletic Strategy. A search is underway for the Cats' next AD, with Gregg to remain in place until his successor takes over. Once he begins the new job, Gregg's main focus will be all matters regarding NIL and student-athlete revenue sharing. With that, welcome you inside this edition of Big Ten Today, presented by Gatorade. I'm Rick Pizzo. It is Northwestern Day here on Big Ten Network. Check in with Chris Collins in just a little bit. Plus, UCLA women's volleyball coach Alfie Reft joins us all the way from Japan to talk about not just the Big Ten schedule release, but what we should expect from his team this coming season. But we begin, as we usually do, with the big story, and it is that Big Ten volleyball schedule release. You see some notable matchups late September. Purdue hosting Penn State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, always salty. UCLA's first road trip to Lincoln. Meanwhile, USC opening up at home against Ohio State. You see Oregon, Penn State early October, and then all the West Coast schools battling against each other on October the 13th. Some interesting parameters went into this schedule with the new teams and all the travel and all the logistics that have been put in place. And here are some of those parameters. A maximum of 4 split weekends per institution. Look at that second note. 2 travel-efficient away trips per institution. That's the minimum. That means when you go on a road trip at least twice a year, they will be as close geographically as possible. The mirror matchups protect all those rivalries. You see how often the East, Central, and Pacific time zone schools have to go in the opposite direction, and there will only be 4 consecutive home and road matches same weekend for each team. Again, trying to make all the travel fair, equitable, and realistic. And for much more, we bring in Big Ten Network volleyball analyst Emily Eamon, who is all the way over in Hong Kong covering international volleyball right now. But Emily, we start with the Big Ten news and that schedule release. What's your biggest takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway was I do not envy the job of the schedulers to put together this type of schedule. You went through some of those parameters. There were so many decisions that went into creating this schedule. You have to balance now those 4 West Coast schools. The travel schedule is going to be difficult, but I think they did an incredible job, like you mentioned, protecting some of those rivalries and also really thinking about the student athlete first and trying to make the travel as easy and as manageable as possible, because as we all know, that is something that's been very difficult to do across sports. But I'm excited for the schedule. It clearly puts up some big matchups toward the end of the year that I think we all naturally look forward to, and it's going to be really exciting to see that Big Ten title race come down to the wire.
Well, let's get into some of those matchups. Great rivalry matchups, West Coast versus East Coast, old school rivalries and perhaps new ones as well. Which matchups stand out to you?
Well, the big 2, I think, are, of course, those Wisconsin and Nebraska matchups. The number 1 to me is that Wisconsin at Nebraska game, November 23rd. Wisconsin has made the Final Four the last 4 of 5 seasons. Nebraska made the championship match 2 of the last 3. The Big Ten title race usually comes down to this, and it's always a bloodbath between these 2 teams. They split matches last year as Nebraska got their first win over Wisconsin since 2017. And then they also have that first matchup. Nebraska plays at Wisconsin November 1st. And I think if that first matchup is anything like we saw last year, we're in for a real treat. We saw a number 1 versus number 2 undefeated game. And not only that, but these are 2 of the most dominant teams in the country. And this has become a rivalry that has run so deep between these 2 programs. So those matchups, I am always looking forward to. Another one at the end of the year that I think people have their eye on is Nebraska at Penn State on November 29th. It is so far deep into the Big Ten season. It's definitely going to have NCAA tournament implications in terms of seeding for those 2 teams that are sure to be in that top 16 to host through the regional finals. Now, we got to think back to the last time Nebraska was in Happy Valley. They reverse swept Penn State in a whiteout. I was lucky enough to call that match, and I think I'm still kind of deaf from it. It was one of the loudest matches that I think I've ever been a part of. So that one's definitely one that I have circled on my calendar. And then, of course, a few others. UCLA and USC, I am so excited that we in the Big Ten finally get to experience that rivalry, one of the best in college sports. There's so much history combined between those 2 programs, 10 national championships. Also, those are 2 teams that are vying for an NCAA tournament bid, and it might come down to those 2 matches for both of those teams.
Purdue, Oregon, also very late in the year. Two teams that, again, expect to be in the NCAA tournament, could be for seeding as well. Emily, so many of those matchups that you talked about a year ago and how good they were affected by players that came from one Big Ten school to transfer to another Big Ten school, and we've seen that again from last season to this season. What are the top transfer stories we should be watching and waiting for heading into the 2024 campaign?
Well, the biggest one in the Big Ten, and I really think the biggest one in the country right now, is outside Taylor Landfair going from Minnesota out to Nebraska. Landfair was a 2022 Big Ten Player of the Year, and she's entering an already stacked Nebraska squad. This is a young Nebraska team that is coming off a national championship match berth, and they bring back that entire starting lineup. And you're plugging in one of the most lethal and terminal pins in the entire country in Landfair. That team is going to be so tough to stop. One other one that I definitely have my eye on is outside Allie Batenhorst. She's going from Nebraska out to USC. Batenhorst has been a huge part of that lineup from Nebraska for the last 3 seasons. She started in 2 national championship matches, and USC needs a terminal and consistent pin to replace the legendary Skylar Fields, who has just graduated from that squad. One other terminal middle hitter that I'm looking at is Maggie Mendelson. She's going from Nebraska out to Penn State. She's been kind of a backup middle blocker in Nebraska for her few seasons there, but she's always been consistent. Coach Cook always knew that when he put her in the match, she was going to be a big game changer. She's taking on a new role at Penn State. She's going to start most of those matches, and they need a good replacement at middle as well. So I expect her to be a really big piece of that Penn State offense.
Great stuff, as always, from Emily Eamon. Em, we appreciate the time. Enjoy watching all that fantastic volleyball out in Hong Kong. Can't wait to see you back here in Chicago in our studios.
Yeah, happy to be back. Thank you, guys.